Nobody asked him to build it. Nobody named him in a succession plan. Nobody put his picture on the wall or told the board he was coming. But somehow, within less than 2 years of the founder's death, a man with no founding connection to Daystar Television Network, no decades of sacrifice, no history of suffering for that ministry, found himself sitting at the center of one of the most powerful Christian broadcasting organizations in the entire world. And the man who was actually supposed to be there, he got a termination letter delivered to his front door. Today, we need to talk about exactly how that happened, because the story of how Doug Weiss walked into Daystar is not just a story about one man. It is a story about systems, about power, about what happens when the right people go silent at exactly the wrong moment. Stay with me, because this one goes deep. Before we talk about who took over, we need to talk about who built it. Marcus and Joni Lamb started Daystar Television Network with pure hearts. This was not a calculated business move. This was a calling. And almost from the moment they started, God confirmed it. Within the very first week, one of their first stations came to life. And around that same time, their son Jonathan was born. Think about that timing. Son born, ministry born, a legacy being laid down brick by brick from the very beginning. Marcus didn't leave that to chance when he was on his deathbed with people in the room. Joni, his daughter Rachel, his daughter-in-law Susie, and a woman named Denise Boggs, who was called in specifically to be a witness. Marcus Lamb looked at the people he loved most and said clearly, Jonathan was supposed to lead Daystar, not the board, not a committee, his son, the one born the same week the ministry launched. Marcus named him out loud with witnesses. And then, Marcus died. And what happened next was the exact opposite of what he asked for. And for years, consistently, publicly, Doug Weiss praised his own wife, Lisa. He called her the purest heart he had ever met. He talked about her eyes. He used his own marriage as living proof that his methods actually worked. That was the brand. That was the credibility. Then, Marcus Lamb died in November 2021. And within less than 2 months, not 2 years, not even 2 seasons of grief, Doug filed for divorce from Lisa, the woman he had publicly praised for decades. Gone. The divorce was finalized by May 2022. And by June 2023, just about a year later, Doug Weiss married Joni Lamb. Let that timeline sit with you. Now here is the question nobody inside that circle has ever answered publicly. Why did the divorce happen? Because according to the documented record, and this is something Joni Lamb and Jimmy Evans themselves admitted on air, there was no adultery on either side. No infidelity. No abandonment in the traditional documented sense. Which means that by the strictest biblical standard, the standard that Marcus Lamb's own Church of God background firmly held, there weren't no biblical grounds for that divorce. At all. Yet, it happened. And a man named Jimmy Evans suggested emotional abuse. They could push any narrative they wanted. And Lisa, legally bound, could not respond. Allegedly through a paid non-disclosure agreement that kept her from speaking publicly about any of it to this day. Think about what that means. The moment Lisa signed that document, Doug and Joni gained the power to frame the story any way they chose. They could imply abandonment. They could suggest emotional abuse. They could push any narrative they wanted. And Lisa, legally bound, could not respond. Then Doug introduced a concept to explain the divorce. He called it intimacy anorexia, when a spouse deliberately and intentionally withholds emotional, sexual, and spiritual connection from their partner. Here is what you need to know about that term. It is not in the DSM. It is not recognized by any legitimate psychological association. Intimacy anorexia is not a real clinical diagnosis. It is a term Doug Weiss invented, his concept, his framework, his product. And he used it to diagnose his own wife, the woman he had publicly called the purest heart he had ever met, and transform her overnight from his beloved partner into his silent abuser. After marrying Joni Lamb, Doug Weiss didn't just become her husband, he moved in. He began appearing regularly on Ministry Now and other Daystar programs. He positioned himself not just as a husband, but as a ministry partner, a co-leader, a presence at the center of a network he had no founding connection to, that he had not built, that he had not sacrificed for. And Jonathan Lamb saw it. That is why, at a critical meeting on July 11th, Jonathan refused to comply with what was being asked of him. Because what he was being asked to do was not simply accept his mother's new husband. He was being asked to accept a complete restructuring of everything his father had built.
To smile on camera for a man who had inserted himself into the apex of a ministry that was never his. To read viewer comments praising a marriage his conscience could not clear. To perform endorsement for something he believed on biblical and ethical grounds was wrong. And when he refused, he was removed, demoted, salary cut by 40%, surveilled. A private investigator tracked him and Susie. And on November 20th, 2024, a document arrived at his front door, delivered by someone named Shannon Kelly, telling Marcus Lamb's son that he was no longer an employee of the ministry his father built. That image, that single image, should stop you cold.
So who is running Daystar now? 3 people: Arnold Torres, Steve Wilhite, and Rachel Lamb. Arnold Torres was the CFO, a man whose entire position depends on staying on the right side of whoever holds power in that building. Joni herself brought him on camera and called him a blessing, saying he walked with her through the storm after Marcus passed. Steve Wilhite publicly called one commentator covering this story a clickbait cockroach, because that commentator was simply pointing out that there was sin at the top of the ministry. That response alone was enough to earn his hostility. And now he is one of the people running Daystar. And then there is Rachel. Rachel's story is complicated. By multiple accounts, she and Joni did not have an easy relationship. Marcus knew it. People close to the family knew it. Rachel reportedly felt like an orphan after Marcus died because of how strained things were between her and her mother. But at some point, the tension shifted. Rachel aligned with her mother's choices, including the marriage to Doug, including the sidelining of Jonathan. And now she is sitting in a seat that by her father's own dying words was supposed to belong to her brother. 3 people, none of them named by Marcus, none of them designated by the founders themselves.
Then Joni died, May 7th, 2026, and almost immediately, Doug Weiss disappeared. Not just from Daystar programming, from everywhere. His Dr. Doug Weiss handle, the page that was always active, always putting out heart-to-heart counseling content, went completely silent. He has not been featured on a single Daystar program since the memorial. The contrast between his behavior before and after Joni's illness is documented and time-stamped. He went largely quiet for weeks while his wife was fighting for her life. He appeared once on Easter Friday alongside Rachel Lamb Brown to ask for prayer, then vanished. He continued posting regular heart-to-heart content on his personal Instagram while Joni was in critical condition.
And 2 days after her death, with the Christian world in mourning, his Instagram featured a post about who is responsible for cheating in a relationship. Not a tribute, not a grief post, not a single word about Joni Lamb. That behavior tells a story that no statement can fully undo. Here is why his disappearance matters. Doug Weiss's authority at Daystar was never structural. It was never institutional. It was never built on decades of sacrifice for that ministry. His access to Daystar was entirely dependent on his marriage to Joni Lamb. She was the apex. She was the president. Her name was on the door. And now she is gone. Which means the relational foundation of Doug Weiss's position inside Daystar Television has been removed. He is not the founder's son. He is not a board member with decades of history. He came in through marriage, and the person he married is dead. The partners are watching, the audience is watching, and the documented record of what happened to Jonathan and Susie Lamb, the recordings, the meetings, the public statements, does not disappear because Joni is gone. It becomes more visible, because now there is no apex to enforce a narrative around it. Now, here is the part of the story that I think gets overlooked in all the noise. On May 30th, 2026, Jonathan Lamb made a post. He drove out to Dallas to the site of one of his father's original broadcast towers, the very infrastructure that represented where Daystar began. He stood there, filmed it, and talked about God's faithfulness. Not with bitterness, not with a threat, just a man standing at the place where it all started saying, God, thank you, even here, even now, even like this. And Susie, she posted this. Don't dwell on the pain of the past. Instead, dive into the joy of the present. And if ever you need perspective, the mountains and ocean are calling. These two people have made a decision. The fight for Daystar is over for them. They are not looking backwards. They are not positioning themselves for a takeover. They have closed that chapter. Jonathan was fired from a network, but he was not fired from his calling. He was a worship leader before he was a vice president. He was a minister of the gospel before he was a television executive. And it appears that is exactly who he is returning to. The Israel and Ariel podcast, named after his own children, tells you everything about where his heart is now. Not building a competing empire, building something with meaning, with family at the center of it, with integrity as the foundation. That is not weakness. That is one of the strongest things a person can do.
But here is the thing that should not get lost in all of this. Daystar Television Network reaches over 200 countries. It was built on the shoulders of people who gave their lives to broadcasting the gospel. That legacy is real and it is significant. But a legacy is not a license. A history of good work does not give any institution the right to operate without transparency, without accountability, and without treating its own people, including its own family, with basic dignity and Christian love.
The documented record shows that things went very wrong inside Daystar. A son was demoted, surveilled, and fired. A daughter-in-law was removed from her hosting role. The parents of that daughter-in-law were let go. Allegations of covering up harm to a child were raised publicly and fiercely contested. Whether every allegation is true or not, the manner in which the institution handled these matters left a wound in the body of Christ that is still open. And the system that produced all of this, it is still intact inside those walls. The board is still there. The programs are still running. Doug Weiss, the man whose presence inside Daystar was entirely dependent on his marriage to the woman who just died, is still in the picture in ways that have not yet been publicly defined or explained. That is the question every Daystar partner, every viewer, every person who has followed this story needs to be asking right now. What is Doug Weiss's role inside Daystar Television now that Joni Lamb is gone? Because the answer to that question will tell you everything about whether anything has actually changed inside that ministry or whether the system is simply finding its next form. Systems outlive their builders, and the people who pay the highest price are never the people at the top. That has been true at Daystar from the very beginning. Marcus Lamb named his son with his last breath. That birthright has not disappeared just because the people currently sitting in that building would prefer everyone forget it exists. Jonathan and Susie Lamb walked through a fire. They came out the other side choosing peace, choosing faith, choosing God. And Ecclesiastes 12:14 says it plainly. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Not maybe, not some deeds, every deed, every hidden thing. That is not a threat, that is a promise. The Daystar story is not over. It is just entering a new chapter. And whoever writes it, Rachel, Rebecca, Joshua, the board, the executive team, will be writing it under the weight of everything that has already happened. May they write it wisely. May they write it humbly. And may they write it in a way that honors the God in whose name this ministry was built.